Welcome to P2X Learning Camp. I am Anil Patel. Today we'll see what is variable scope. So far in the series we know where, let and const are the keyword used to create a container which stores a data. When you create a variable using a where keyword, then this variable value can be changed and can be redeclared with other keywords. But when you use a let, then you can change or reassign the value, but you cannot able to create a variable with the same name. And you know the const, when you create a variable using const, you need to assign the value at the same time, and you cannot redeclare the variable. Also, you cannot reassign the value when you declare a variable with a const. So const is constant throughout the program, as the name suggests. So what is scope? Scope is defined as the limitation or the limit of the boundary to access this variable. In Hindi, scope means daira. So when I define a variable using a let keyword and I assign some value, then to access this let variable, we need to access within the block. If we are accessing this variable outside the block, it won't be allowed to access it. See, name is not defined because when you define a variable using let or const, these are available within the boundary of these curly braces. The scope of the let and the const is called as a block scope. But this is not the case with the where keyword. When you declare a variable using a where keyword, then it can be accessed outside the block because where is not a block scope. So you hope you understand what is a block scope, that the scope of the variable is within the curly braces limit. Let's understand what is functional scope. So when I declare a function like scope, I declare a function named scope, then whatever variable that I declare inside the function is not accessible outside the function. If I write node scope.js, it say name is not defined because I declare this name inside this function. So this variable has a scope or a limitation or accessibility boundary within this functional. So if I define console.log name inside and I put name some value like users, then when you invoke this function, then this name is accessible in within the boundary of this function. This is called as a functional scope and local scope or local scope because this variable is look for the local scope first. If it doesn't find on the local scope, then it will look for the outer scope. Like if I see, so it's saying name is not defined, but if I define it an outer, so when you invoking the function, it will try to see like whether this variable has been declared inside the functional scope or not. If it is not declared inside the functional scope, then it will look in the outer scope, and if it find in the outer scope, then it will have the access to the outer scope. And this variable defined in the outer scope has an access to the functional scope and to the block scope. So if I run it, it shows Anil and right, I didn't saved it. Okay, if I run it, it shows twice Anil because this variable is accessed inside the function and inside the block. So this variable has a global scope. So when when I declared a function inside the when I declare a variable inside the function, then that variable scope is within that function. It's called as a local scope or a functional scope. When I define a function in the outer space, then that will available to the function as well as the block. This is called as a global scope. When I define the variable inside the block, then this variable, if I define with let and const, then it is accessible within this block. That is called as a block scope. And if you forgot to define a variable without any keyword, then this is a global scope. If you forgot to define a variable without any keyword, then this is a global scope. If I access it, name it okay, name is not defined because we haven't called scope first. If we call scope first, then it says Anil. So if we did not define without any keyword, then it's in a global scope. If we define with a keyword, then that variable is available to the functional scope only. Hope you understand what is functional scope, block scope, and a global scope. It's just the limitation or the boundary of the accessibility of the variable. Thank you. Let's see into the next class.